Fourth element, as always, clean up. Even though it says clean up, it's not the same in every competency. So for this element, clean up actually has 5 performance criteria. The first one, that the work area is cleared and materials disposed of, reused or recycled in accordance with legislation, regulations, codes of practice, job specification. Okay. The key thing is here that you're doing it by the book. If there's rules, codes of practice, regulations, that you're not basically like, let's say, you got some broken materials, you don't just dump it in the bush. All right, you don't just try and bury it on site. That you're disposing of it properly. Most sites will have a skip bin, and then when you're doing that, you're not just basically tossing it in willy-nilly. If you stack stuff into a skip bin better, you get a lot more into the skip bin, because they're usually paid for by the bin. So the more you can fit in the bin, doesn't matter if it weighs more, they're taking it by the bin load. All right, so, but can any materials be reused? That's the biggest thing. If you can reuse carpentry materials over and over and over for things like formwork, you try and do that, because it's going to reduce your overall costs in the long run. You might have to replace the formwork a couple of months down the track, but you've gotten a few months worth of forming out of that, rather than just buying the formwork for every single job. If it can't be reused, can it be recycled? And if it can't be recycled, and by recycled, yeah, I might be able to use that in a different job as well. They might have screws listed as part of a recyclable material for carpentry. Big metal bin, chucking stuff in there. Okay, depends on your materials, but you basically need to be able to show that you could either reuse it, recycle it, or dispose of it appropriately according to regulations. Second performance criteria, hazardous materials identified for separate handling. This is a really important one when it comes to handling carpentry materials, because one of the things you'll notice in the knowledge requirement for this one is that you can identify asbestos and know how to deal with that. And in most cases, it's that you don't do anything with it. You identify it, you let your foreman know, and they figure out and get the appropriate group or company in to remove, dispose of, anything like that. This competency, while it's in our cluster D for formwork and doing formwork, it's in relation to handling all carpentry materials. You're going to be handling carpentry materials when you're doing framing as well. So you need to think about that as well too, and that you do separate those sort of things out. You don't just throw all your rubbish into the same skip bin. Asbestos would have to be dealt with separately. Plaster could have to be dealt with separately to timber, bricks, that sort of stuff. Third one, non-toxic materials are removed using correct procedures. Okay, so it's not toxic, so there's no specific PPE requirement, or there's no hazardous material type thing that you need to try and deal with, but you can still remove it appropriately using the correct procedures. If you're dismantling or doing demolition, you don't just smash willy-nilly. I know they show that on TV a lot. Let's go and do the demo. Let's just go jumping through the plasterboard, smashing it up with the sledgehammers. If you do that, there's a lot more cleanup involved, and this is part of cleanup. So if you can dismantle stuff appropriately and take it down so that there's less mess, it also means that it's easier to dispose of or reuse, store elsewhere, and that sort of thing. Fourth criteria, dust suppression procedures are used to minimise health risks to work personnel and others. Okay, on a full site, just basically the wet down is a dusting thing, but with regards to handling of carpentry materials, you want to make sure that if you've got dust extraction on a power saw, that you try and use that. If you've got, so when you're using a drop saw or a circular saw, drop saw, yes, definitely, they will have dust bags on them. Circular saws, track saws in particular, you can have dust extraction attached to them, but you might not necessarily have those. So you want to try and see if you can have those things to reduce the amount of dust on the work site, especially if you're working with a large group of people, because it says you want to minimise the health risk to work personnel and others on site. Okay. Fifth performance criteria, tools and equipment are cleaned, checked, maintained and stored in accordance with manufacturer recommendations and standard work practices. Generally, okay, you want to make sure that you don't have moisture left on saws, saw blades, those sort of things. Hand saws, if you're out doing formwork in this instance, some of the formwork might be wet timber. A lot of framing timber isn't completely seasoned. If you're using treated pine, those sort of things, they're definitely wet, and cutting those things will lead to your saws getting rusty, your power saws getting rusty, all those sort of things, and that can dull the blade in the long run. So you need to make sure that you can basically clean up things, pack them away properly, make sure that cords on power tools are okay and serviceable at the end of the day as well as the start of the day, and that you can do all that in the right order.